Okay, so guys, first off, welcome to our professional development meeting. This is actually geared towards everyone, but specifically students and those young in their careers to let you know kind of with a couple of people with their supply chain careers and like what's possible, right? All the cool things that you can do. So we've got Derek and John Hart, and they're going to be discussing that kind of fireside chat
So keep an
method.
eye out on our post on LinkedIn, social media, and on the newsletter. Yeah, back to you, Tammy.
Okay. So, and with that, we're going to get started. So, let me introduce Derek. So, Derek and I actually met some number of years ago, we're not going to talk about, working for one of the largest petrochemical companies. And so, Derek is amazing. He's a global supply chain leader. He's led international teams. His experience is finance, sales, strategy, supply chain. He's led international teams that delivered strategic initiatives, some huge ones in logistics and in third-party operations. Um, Again, he's cross-functional, if you can imagine a third-party team and running everything, it's basically running I don't even know how many, Derek. We had so many. He had everything, both third-party operations, third-party suppliers, and the control of their operating environments. So, in addition to this, Derek serves as our VP of Student Activities. As the president, I can tell you I am incredibly excited to have Derek. He brings a lot of passion and a love for students and those young in their career, and his mentorship is just invaluable both to you guys and to me. So, with that, Derek, I'm going to hand over to you.
All right. Well, Tammy, thank you for those very kind words. I appreciate it. It's a joy for me to be here with you. And it really is my distinct honor to welcome John Hark to join me in this conversation today. And funny, I see Alex has joined us, so I got to meet John through Alex Garrett, and I think he's here to make sure that I'm treating you right, John. So Alex is going to keep me in check. But as I said, it's really my honor. I'm going to be looking down to reading a couple of things because there's so much really to speak about on John. But he's really had a distinguished career in the Houston maritime community. He's currently serving as the North America Chartering Director at Bertling, and he holds a bachelor's in science and master's in maritime business administration from Texas A&M, where he's also an adjunct professor. He is active in numerous industry and education initiatives, particularly focusing on where and how industry and education can work together to really bring and help close the talent pipeline gap that we might have. He sits on numerous advisory councils with a number of colleges and universities in the Houston area. He serves on the boards of a number of organizations, nonprofit and otherwise, including Friends of ASCM with the Houston Maritime Center and Museum that just recently opened. He, serves on the editorial board of Break Bulk Magazine, so he's very much on the front line of industry and industry news. So really a pleasure for me to welcome John to join us here today. Really excited to hear a bit more about your career, John, hearing a bit about what your thoughts are on the supply chain industry and where that might be going, and really, the opportunity to learn from you myself.
Yep.
So welcome.
Looking forward to the conversation. Thanks.
Absolutely. So why don't we just start? We'll just start with where we are today. So perhaps share a bit about Bertling and your role there.
Yep.
Tell us about what you do.
Bertling is a global capital project logistics execution provider. So our specialty is capital project logistics execution, but we do all types of freight forwarding and logistics around the world, but mainly focused around mining, energy, oil and gas, infrastructure, and so those verticals. But we do look at other things. We've also got specialist groups in Sweden that are dealing with environmental logistics, with waste to energy. We've got dangerous goods divisions. We've got ship owning and operating. We're one of the oldest ship owners in Germany. The company's been around since 1865. Right. So fully integrated. We do our own IT as well for our ERP system for our freight forwarding operations. And I've been with the company for it'll be 24 years in the spring, and have had various roles. Started out on our vessel side, moved into the logistics side. When you were the company a quarter of a century almost, you're going to go into different aspects, and you need to be open to those. We'll probably talk about that a little bit more. And so I've held roles as Chief Operating Officer for Latin America, Regional Director for North America, Chartering Director. In my current role, I oversee our chartering activities, which is quite a bit, and oversee our dangerous goods division, which I started about 16 and a half years ago.
Right.
And then part of the senior leadership team here in the US.
Excellent. I mean, that's quite a very career. And I'd love to dive a bit into not
Yep.
only, what some of those different elements are, but the fact that, you can have that variety of roles, even if you're staying in the same organization. So I think that's
Right.
great. So maybe just share a bit more. What is chartering? And so what do you do as a
Yeah,
charterer?
with chartering, what I'm talking about there is when we've got cargo that needs to be moved somewhere that won't fit in a container, and I'm talking ocean chartering, not air chartering, right? Similar in that they're sort of away from the liner scheduled services, but here in our office, on any day, one of my colleagues will have a large piece. It won't fit in a container. It could be something that's, 400 or 500 metric tons, even heavier. And we need to put together a proposal for the client, which
Right.
is all of the technical aspects, the loading, the discharging, the sea fastening. We get our engineers involved depending on the complexity of the piece. And so I'm drawing on more than 30 years in the Houston maritime industry, with
Right.
my contacts, because as a practitioner, you count on obviously your service providers. And I tell my students often that in order to be good in any field, especially chartering, since that's what I've been in for so long, you basically need the trust of your clients, but you even more need the trust of the overall market who you're going to service your clients. And
Right.
so I have to be able to go and get numbers quickly, more detailed sometimes, and that comes upon my experience. So it's putting the initial pricing together and the plan together. And then if we get the business or not, if we get the business, then I become involved in helping execute the shipment
Right.
from an oversight and negotiating. And negotiating ocean charters, it's a very old, sort of antiquated process that, there's a lot of back and forth with counter offers and offers depending on the
Right.
complexity. And so that's what I get involved on. So it's moving cargo that's not on regular services that requires, most of the time that it's probably not going to fit in containers.
Right. No, thank you for that. That's
Right.
a great overview. I mean, I think, when I think of supply chain, I think in the rubric of plan, source, make, deliver, right? And I think a lot of folks might have a fairly narrow view of what that might mean. But even
And
just
we,
in
yeah,
talking about chartering, you
right.
hit three of those,
Yeah.
right? You're
And
planning,
we
you're
hit it early.
sourcing,
Yeah.
and you're moving it.
Yeah, when we get into the early stages, we talk specifically about capital project logistics. There's these different stages like sort of feasibility and pre-feed, which is front-end engineering and design, and then
Right.
feed, and then hopefully execution. And we're often called upon as a logistics provider in the early stages before maybe
Right.
even the green light, a final investment decision has been given to the project to
Right.
give pricing, guidance, and planning and execution ideas.
Right. And I think that's a great element of, you're not just limited to executing the activity, but you're
Right.
part of that decision making. I think
Value
that's
add.
really
Yeah.
that's an important step. So how did you get started in
Yeah.
chartering and maritime?
Yeah, I grew up in the Northeast,
Okay.
and when I was looking for colleges, I spent a lot of time on the water. And
Okay.
typical 17-year-old, I didn't really know what those fields could be, but I thought I
Right.
wanted to be somewhere near it. My initial thinking was to be in naval architecture and marine
Okay.
engineering and designing boats. I applied to Texas A&M Maritime. I knew about the school here from coming down in the summers in high school and spending time with my aunt and uncle that were in Galveston and had a fishing boat that fished offshore. So I knew about the
Right.
campus because we would go by the Galveston A&M campus on the way
Okay.
offshore. And I applied there and to one other school in New Jersey, and got into A&M and came to A&M again, thinking maybe I would look at marine engineering and naval architecture, but I decided quickly I couldn't handle engineering math. So I went the maritime business administration route at Texas A&M,
Right.
which in 1985, when I started, I think the year before was the first graduating class. So although Texas A&M Maritime had been in existence since the late 60s, the maritime business degree was fairly new. So I was
Right.
fairly early in the program. Graduated in 1989. So typical traditional student, 21 years old, finished it in 4 years, followed the catalog, moved back to New Jersey for a year, and applied for my first job out of school with a marine insurance provider. And kind of an interesting fact, it was before the internet. And I actually applied to the New York Times classified, which would come out on Sundays with
Huh.
all the jobs.
I think
And
you're gonna have to explain what a classified is for some of
classified ad was
the
basically
call.
the section of the New York Times where all the job openings were listed because there was no internet, and you put your package together and sent it off, and then waited to hear from them by
Right.
regular mail back. So went to work in this inland marine underwriting job. Wasn't quite sure what that meant. I just saw marine in the title, but it actually had to do with trucking and property insurance that is kind of odd, like radio towers and band, music band instruments and weird cover.
Wow.
Did that for about a year, and then I decided I wanted to move back to Texas, where I had gone to
Right.
school and where my network was. And I had two paths I was looking at. My dad was a retired policeman, and so I actually applied to Houston Police Department and wanted to be a policeman. And at the same time, was talking to my buddies that had graduated with me and went into the maritime industry. Got pretty far along in the process with HPD, that
Okay.
enough that they sent an investigator to New Jersey to interview our neighbors and my employers in high school and things like that.
Right.
And a good friend of mine, this shows the power of the network, that the job that I got it through the New York Times with Kemper Insurance is really the only job I ever got that wasn't through a connection through the network.
Mm.
That was the
Right.
only one ever. And I was pretty far along in the process, and my buddy came to me and said, Damco Maritime's looking for somebody to work in operations. They're opening an office. It was a non-vessel operating common carrier, a logistics firm. Pete Van Etten was the branch manager. Some of you know Pete. He's still in the business, and he gets the credit of giving me my first job in the industry here in Houston. We're still good friends, and he
Okay.
hired me. And so my dad was very happy that I did not become a cop in Houston, because he was a cop in a town with about 14,000 people and kept telling me it's going to be a
Right.
lot different than what you've seen me growing up. And so I decided, okay, I'm going to do the maritime thing. And that's how I ended up working in the maritime and logistics industry
Right.
through a connection.
Right. Now you've touched on a lot of different things. I mean,
Yeah.
one, not only the career path you've taken within the maritime industry, but then even just choices to get into maritime versus what some of the other paths might have been. So I mean, looking at somebody coming through school or somebody early in their professional career, what would you say are some of those decision points, right? That made you go left versus right, or
Yeah.
that sort of influenced how you thought about that? Because I can't imagine,
Yeah.
when you started, you necessarily saw this is where I'm going. I'm going to end up where you are today.
Had no idea, but I also would say that we didn't know as much as we know today. I
Mm,
think because of the internet, and it's sort of cliche-ish, but we are much more connected, right?
right.
And so coming out, I didn't even know, for instance, what an EPC was. I'd never even
Mm,
heard of it. And my uncle actually worked for one, but I didn't even know then what he did was what I would end
right.
up doing someday later,
Right.
and which is engineering, procurement, construction firm, right? And so today the students have access right through their career placement counselors, through
Yeah.
school
Yeah.
clubs like we have at A&M and other schools have. You can see a lot more of the opportunities now.
Hmm.
And what I would say is that don't stress too much about the first choice.
Right.
It's your first choice. And I always tell students, they're like, well, what if I get this offer and then this offer? I'm like, don't stress. Let's cross that bridge when we get to it, right?
Right.
If you have a couple different things to pick from, that'll be a good problem to have.
Hmm.
But again, that first job out of school it's your first job. Is it possible
Right.
you stay in that your whole career?
Hmm.
Yes. But for me, it wasn't, right? I mean, I
Yeah.
had 4 jobs before I got to Bertling,
Mm,
and each one was around 4 or 5 years.
right.
And so they each stepped. But I think for students today, look at the opportunities. And again, don't stress too much about that first job, and
Right.
don't be afraid to take maybe a risk with that first job.
Mm. No, I love that concept of taking risks, and I
Right.
think if you hadn't taken some of those first steps, have been willing to move, you wouldn't be where you are today, right? And I think you touched
Correct.
on two things I think that are really important to call out that I kind of want to double click on. Is one is you talked about network, right? So the opportunity that is meeting and engaging with a wide variety of people, to then have the second bit, which is now visibility to what some of those choices are and options that you have. So first I'll put a little plug. I think that's where organizations like this with ASCM are great. Not just ASM, ASCM, you have ISM, CMCP, other organizations. So certainly encourage folks to really engage broadly and get a much, a sense of what's available out there. There are a lot more opportunities in supply chain than you or I could have possibly imagined, when we first got into this. So thank you for bringing that up. I think, as you sort of look back on making some of those choices, what do you think were some of the qualities that might have defined what success looked like for you, and how would somebody that is either a student or starting early think about how you define that success? So if I maybe add a bit more, you talked about not worry too much about that first role, for example. Okay, so now I'm in the role. How do I think about what success looks like, and maybe what I do next?
I like, and you and I haven't talked about this at all, but when you say what's a success look like, when I talk to students and coach them when they're interviewing for jobs, one of the things I say to them is, you need to find out from that interview, what does success look like to them for you in 3 months, in 6 months, in a year, in 2 years. You need to know what their expectations are.
Right.
You have to, and just ask them, what does success look like? And I tell enough students this, that every once in a while an employer will know that it was somebody that had talked to me, because they'll have 3 come through that all said, what does success look like? And so part of this is you need to know the expectations.
Right.
And I say they need to know your expectations. You have to tell them what you think success looks like, but more importantly, that you meet their expectations. Because that's typically when we see the most failure in human resources and employment, is where expectations are not matching, both from the student, that new employee, as well as the employer. And so I say to them, ask what is successful like. I give them a few questions. Whose support within the company is critical for your success?
Right. What
skills will you need to learn, assuming they realize you're sort of an entry level, or maybe somewhat not too far after entry level. So again, it's meeting expectations. And then within that, when we talk about your brand, right? Because you start building your brand in that company from the interview and then your first day on, you need to show, for sure, a sense of urgency and work ethic, right? Those are key. And in the interview, you need to get it across that you already have that within you, right? A sense of urgency and that work ethic. But if you've got those things, to me, and you know what their expectations are, it shouldn't be hard to be successful within that first role. And when you're first starting, there's going to be gates to go through of success, right? The first one is, do you make it past the 90-day probationary period, right? Some people don't.
Yeah.
Sometimes the employee says, that's just not for me. I'm out, right? And so they pull the cord and bail out. So, but that, I hope that sort of answers. I mean, it's very important. You should have your own ideas of success.
Right.
But you also need to know what they expect of you.
Absolutely. I think that willingness to ask questions, I think, is itself a critical success factor, right? And I think, especially now, as you mentioned earlier, so much is visible. There's a lot of research you can do. You can go into a room with a view of what that organization is driven by, but then being willing to actually hear it and ask them and bring them into that conversation, I think is really critical. I mean, one of the things that I always ask about, I always encourage folks to think about, is ask them, well, what do you measure? What are you measured on, right? What are the things that make you successful when you're being evaluated? And again, that increases that sense of ownership and connection.
And I hear often from employers that interviewees don't ask enough questions.
Right.
We know, and I say this is every 99.999% of interviews end with a single question from that employer. Do you have any other questions for us? Or do you have any? And employers tell me they're shocked. They're sitting in front of a manager, a leader, and no, that's it. I'm good. And I always say, save some questions. There should be some curiosity that put you there in the first place. Like to what you said, that's great. Ask them, how are they measured?
Exactly.
How have they done it at the company?
No, exactly. So maybe shift gears a little bit here in terms of, okay, so now you're in your role, you have a view of what success might look like. So how do you advise folks to think about maybe the choices they're making as they're looking to move through their supply chain career, right? How do you help mentor and coach folks through that?
Yeah. I, I see students that come to me and sometimes they're in their first 6 months
Mhm.
and they're like, man, I think I made the wrong decision. Right. And so I say, okay, what's going on? And we talk about it. Like, I don't feel like I'm being challenged. I feel like I made my first thing typically is, okay, it's probably a little early,
Right.
right? To change direction. If in 18 months or 9 months, whatever, when I talk to them, if we're still having this conversation, then maybe there's a problem.
Yeah.
But if you go into a company doing the research, you should already have an idea of what your career path can be,
Right.
whether you expect to be there for 2 years, 4 years, or you think this could be where I'm staying, for the next 15 or 20 years.
Right.
And so have some idea because you have to have your own agency, right? You have to sort of advocate for yourself. And yeah, it may come to the point where, okay, I've learned about as much as I can here. I just talked to somebody recently, and their point was, and this was a fairly senior person, I'm probably not going to get much farther at this company.
Mm.
And they had been there a long time. And that can happen depending on the structure of the firm and where you're
Right.
at within that company. And so I'll often coach more senior type, employees too. But you need to think about, is it meeting your expectations? Are you ready to take that next step? And we all sort of feel when we're getting stagnant, maybe, and it could be after a year. My
Right.
wife figured out it was after about 18 months in her very first job in maritime after
Right.
college.
Right.
And it made sense to make the jump. And so then you think, okay, what is the next step? Can I draw on
Mhm.
what I've been doing here? And what I can say is in each of my jobs, from the insurance to Damco to a shipbroker that became a German ship owner, BBC, to then Enron, and then to Bertling, each one of those, I had each step, the next step drew on my experience and my network from the previous job.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And maybe I'm lucky in that regard, but I can say each job drew on the experience and the network from the previous, some more so than others.
Right. No, I think those are really critical points. And I'll go back to the point about networking. One of the things that oftentimes people forget about networking is you network inside your company as well, right? And it goes
Yes.
back to now that you're in understanding, well, what are how does your company create value?
Yep.
Where, is it strategic intent, is strategic direction? And then where and how then are the roles you're in or roles are adjacent to you that you can connect with to help drive that value creation, right?
Well,
So go, John.
I'll say two things on network.
Yeah,
I think there's two parts to that. One, you're right, you have to network internally.
yeah,
So I always tell people if you're in a hybrid environment, get in the office as much as you can.
absolutely. Yeah.
It just is a fact that when there's promotions and new openings, unfortunately, the person that's
Mhm.
visible out of sight is out of mind. You need to be
Oftentimes, yeah.
networking and getting to know the managers
Mhm.
within the company. Second, students do a lot of networking while they're in school because they get
Yeah.
invited to lunches and dinners.
Mhm.
Then they start that first job, and I see so often they stop the networking.
They stop. Yeah.
And then their network is only their colleagues, which
Yeah.
that's important. But if things happen, we've seen restructurings in oil companies over the last few months,
Absolutely.
right? We've seen it at EPC companies. We see Amazon now
Mhm.
cutting a lot of people.
Right.
Then you're going to count on your external network.
Mhm.
And you don't want to be in a position where your only network is your internal colleagues that you work with. So you've got to somehow make the time to get out there.
Absolutely. So it's important to really strike the balance of
Go to
those two
ASCM
things.
dinners, right? Go
Yeah.
to the professional dinner meetings.
Exactly, exactly. And I think when I think back to sort of I fell into supply chain, right? My career started off in finance, sales, strategy, and ultimately it came into supply chain. But I think it's a willingness, that internal network and external network, to really think about where can I add the most value? What are the things that really, motivate me? I love solving problems. So what are those things that you enjoy doing that you're really interested in investing in yourself? And then opening yourself up, right? And I think not being locked into thinking, well, because I'm in logistics, I have to stay in logistics, or because I'm in planning, I have to stay in planning. That may well be the right answer for you, and you can have a great career
Yep.
in any of those dimensions. But I think, again, that curiosity and being willing to be open to a variety of things are really important. So maybe if I touch on that, in Eric, as you have looked at folks that you're bringing in your career, there's always that tension between breadth, right, and depth, right? What do you? And we haven't talked about this, but what are your thoughts on breadth? That sort of T-shaped career. Do you value more depth? Do you value more breadth, or how do you help folks strike that
It
balance?
probably depends on the role
Right.
and on what you're going to be doing. I mean, if you're if you have in your sights that you want to be a CPO, like a chief procurement officer at a company one day, which is now within the C-suite of many firms, of course,
Right.
you should be sort of thinking, I need to get depth in procurement,
Right.
but perhaps in that type of a career trajectory, you also need to think, can I do procurement of other things besides just one specific thing? Because then you're getting breadth in the whole procurement organization. So you do logistics procurement, raw materials procurement, indirect procurement. Maybe you're working on contracts. Like you can start thinking, that's what I want to do. Like that's the office I want in 15 or 20 years. I need to have breadth, but my depth is still going to stay in procurement as a practice, let's say, just as an example.
No, absolutely spot on. I thank you for sharing that. I think
Yeah.
I'd add to that is also encourage, to have that breadth in dimensions beyond just supply chain. I think one of the
Yeah.
challenges, I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago, and they're talking, this is not supply chain specifically, we're talking about, business process outsourcing. And one of the challenges they're running into is being able to speak the language of value within the organization. So they might talk about, saving dollars, but how does that, energize the organization, whether that's the CFO or the CEO or the chief operating officer. So being able to speak the language of your critical stakeholders is very important. So that CPO needs to be able to speak to the CFO, right? The manufacturer needs to be able to speak to manufacturing, needs to be able to speak to sales, right? So network and navigate again across your stakeholder map, not just within your functional silo. I
So
think
you're right. So you don't necessarily do those roles, but you've gotten to know those roles within the company and within that internal network.
Not precisely. So yeah, maybe building a bit on that. So as you've looked back over your career, what do you reflect on as some of the biggest changes you've seen in supply chain management? Right. I mean, we can talk about technology. We can talk about VUCA. There's a whole lot of things. What are your reflections on that?
There's some buckets that sort of fall into that. For sure, technology is probably in my career, right? I started in the early 90s.
Yeah.
My first business cards, I still have a couple, didn't even have an email address on them and didn't have a cell phone number on them.
Right.
And I can remember using WinFax to send faxes from a PC hooked up to a modem
you mentioned WinFax,
before there was email, right? In chartering, we went from telex to this sort of email-based system and faxing, and then all of a sudden email just exploded right overnight. So it's the technology piece for sure. And within technology, you could also say we moved away from paper. I can remember starting out and doing shippers export declarations, which are like the automated export system filings of companies today, in these yellow 4-piece carbons, right, and on a typewriter. And then that was done. The ERPs changed from mainframe systems to more PC-based operating systems, right, for the ERPs for forwarders and for companies. And so the technology for sure. The other thing that I've seen is the globalization that has happened. I would say that, when I started in the early 90s, it was a global environment, and I was working for a company that was bringing in consolidation containers from Europe to the US, but it wasn't as global as it is today, for sure. And so now you have to have a much better feel for other cultures, other countries, And what comes into play more now is we need to have a better feel for geopolitics and what's happening in governments and trade agreements and tariffs with the US, more so than we did in the past.
Yeah.
And then, but I would also say is now there's the theories of deglobalization. And maybe some of the large east-west trade patterns like Asia to Europe and the US will maybe go to more regional north-south trade patterns. And so you have to expect there. Then I would say too, in supply chain, expectations of customers. I call it the Amazon effect. If we can see where our shipment is on Amazon, why can't, Maersk tell me where my container is at any time, or the trucker tell me exactly when it's going to arrive and send me a picture. I mean, that expectation from the consumer side in supply chain, absolutely, I see it, that expectation now, especially with Gen Z, and I'll give this, they expect that, as they should.
Yeah.
And so that's driving innovation, I think, with visibility and data. And then I would say to finish, it's Gen Z, this new generation, and we've all dealt with new generations over the year. When I came in as a millennial, I was a new generation coming in, right, with the baby boomer generation. But for sure, Gen Z, as they say, is, I guess, maybe the first fully online generation. And so that has certain aspects to it that we need to take into account. And so those are sort of the big changes. The customer expectations, they expect speed now. The technology changed over there. That continues to change, right? We're going to talk a little bit about AI and globalization. We are for sure much more global.
No, you're absolutely right. I think, in some ways, the world has gotten bigger, not smaller, right? As we've done this, it's gotten more complex. We hear that acronym VUCA, right? Volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous. So that's a very different environment that a supply chain professional has to be able to navigate in. We live we live in Murphy's Law in supply chain, where if it can go wrong, it will, right? And the longer those supply chains become, the more things that can go wrong. So maybe kind of tying that back a bit to the conversation we're having a bit earlier. So, I mean, what do you think are some sort of mindset shifts that you've seen supply chain professionals have to sort of make as we're now navigating a different world?
It's a more complicated environment. I think that's almost become cliche, but I think back to post-COVID, right? And I hate to always bring up COVID, but that is a big thing that happened for us in supply chain. A couple of years after COVID, I presented at an industry dinner, and I was presenting about continued disruption. And I was actually worried, well, COVID's over. There's not a lot of disruption. Do I have enough to talk about? And so I had this presentation that had different disruptions. Very quickly after that, we realized disruption is sort of here to stay. I think we always had it, but a lot of people say for many years we were lulled into a complacency that the world was fairly calm. Now, okay, there was the Gulf War, there was Afghanistan. I mean, things were going on, but maybe not to the extent now, but maybe due to globalization and the interconnectedness, things that happen matter more today than they did then, right? And so the mindset now is you have to be up to date with what's going on in the industry. I had a couple calls today, and I brought it up even with some students, right? Like, what's going on with the Houthis overnight? It's a big deal. They actually said going into today, they're going to stop attacking ships. That has huge ramifications for trade that has been avoiding the Suez. So you need to know what's going on with that. You need to have the mindset of what's going on with the tariffs. It's a changing target, but that doesn't mean we don't deal with it, right? You still have to give your organization ideas. You can't just say, no idea. That's not the answer to give. And young people need to come in with those ideas as well, to be able to sort of think on the spot. If they're in a meeting, be expected to be questioned. And in order to answer, that they have to have the mindset too, I know what's going on globally. I'm reading the news, right? I put out a weekly newsletter, and it's sort of the things that I see as a practitioner that people need to be paying attention to. Are there other things? Yeah, I could probably have 3 pages of stuff to pay attention to. But there's key things so you've got to have the mindset. It's not just black swan events. Now we say have gray swan events, right? Black swan are not as often. The gray swans are the ones that are happening maybe more often. So again, disruption is here to stay. Again, it becomes almost cliche, but really that I feel that's the thing. You have to be expecting the unexpected. You have to game out possibilities, with your clients. What if a claim happens here? How are we going to handle it? When a hurricane happens, Fastenal here in Houston, when Beryl happened, a couple of years ago now, almost a couple of years ago, they had trucks pre-positioned, ready to deliver parts and equipment to the plants in Houston that needed to get up and running. FEMA certainly does that, right? They stage trucks. We need to be thinking about that. And Bombardier up in Canada, they formed a tactical team that dives after COVID. They realized we need to secure our supply chain. They dive into not only their tier 1 suppliers, but the tier 2 and the tier 3 suppliers to the tier 1 suppliers.
Absolutely.
And they can't go after all of it, but they pick. And so that's, to me, those are the most successful companies, and those are the most successful employees today that keep that mindset of don't sit back, sense of urgency, and that work ethic and that discipline to stay at it.
No, I love that, because actually, funny enough, those are exactly the things that really animate me about supply chain, right? That global mindset, that systems thinking, to be able to not just look at my little functional silo, but see what are the things that impact it. And that problem mindset, that problem solving, right? Then being able to take that and solving real world problems, of which there's no shortage.
And have some ideas before they happen. What am I going to do?
Exactly. And then you hear continuous improvement, learner mindset, all those buzzwords feed into what you just described. So that's great. So I think you raised it, right? And we'll bring up the 2-letter word that you can't go anywhere without hearing it: AI. Right? You're on LinkedIn, every 2 out of every 3 feeds are AI related. So I mean, what's your in your space, what's your sense of AI? How do we as supply chain professionals engage on AI?
So I look at it from both an education standpoint as a professor, right, in the academic environment, and also from business. And I think it's sort of related, that those two environments. I see sort of the beginnings of AI. It reminds me a little bit of blockchain. Everybody was talking about it. There was a time when I was telling my students, blockchain, you better know about blockchain.
Right.
Then blockchain kind of died out.
Yeah.
And at least in the maritime industry, it was, now you got to worry about decarbonization. That's the big challenge.
Right.
AI, it's similar in a way that that's all we're talking about. But to me, as the expression says, AI has legs. Like it is happening. It's not going to go away.
Right.
And I always say that, and I can't take credit, I heard it somewhere else, is 2 things: is don't be worried about AI taking your job. Be worried about the person next to you that knows AI and how it can be used taking your job.
Right.
And Jack Welch, who used to say something like, if the pace of change on the outside is faster than on the inside, the end is near. And you can put that with AI. As a professor, I try to keep up with what's going on.
Right.
And whether it's decarbonization with the maritime industry or AI, I feel like both of those things are getting away from me as an educator, also as a business person.
Right.
And so you end up having people then who you can go to that are the specialist in what's going on with decarbonization and specialist in AI. And so AI is happening. It's certainly still in its infancy.
Yeah.
But I think we can all say that it's probably going to just take off like crazy. And that if we have this conversation 18 months from now, even, we may be saying, holy cow, like it did take off. And so you need to be able to use it, play around with it, know what the tools are. I think we all see these things like what you can do every day to learn a bit here about AI and here. Don't be afraid to step up on maybe in committees in your company. We have it at Bertling where we get together every couple of months to talk about ideas for AI and what the company's doing. And so, yeah, it's happening.
Yeah.
And you have to at least be aware. I've said this, if you keep your head in the sand on it, it's going right by you. And it's being used. I think my first criticism of it was when you read about it, you never saw any concrete examples. It was just like, yeah, they're using it or we have to do it. We're finally starting to see some things like we're seeing it with weather forecasting and trucking in the US with the holiday season and winter weather. We're seeing it with training and knowing what employees need the training and using it in training.
Right.
We use it at Bertling already, like with our own internal intranet to be able to have our own like internal LLM, and it
Right.
can go find information for you. So it's here. I think it's going to be incredible what it does
Yeah.
for us. Uh, as a professor, I say this to my students, we need to be able to talk to you about it.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it's going to be just used to write your papers for you. So we have to also be proactive and say, here's
Right.
how we can incorporate it into the class, because you're going to be incorporating your business.
Absolutely. I think I appreciate you bringing the contrast with blockchain, right? I think in many ways,
Yeah.
blockchain was a solution in search of a problem, right? So,
Right.
and now some of that was certainly hindsight looking
Right.
backwards, but you know, you're absolutely right. I think AI, and I think about AI in two dimensions, right? There's one, how does it help you do the job you're doing now better, right? So where can you sort of hand off some of the more mundane routine and free up your capacity to do more?
Yes.
And I think that's an important dimension to look at. It's an incredible thought partner with the right boundary conditions and handrails. So in that dimension, I really encourage folks to learn how to use AI effectively, so you minimize the hallucination, right? You don't want to be that guy with the PowerPoint with stats that everybody looks like it. Where'd you get these numbers from?
Right.
You don't want to be that guy.
Right.
But
And don't be the
AI can,
negative Nancy saying, oh, it'll never happen. It's happening.
but AI is tremendous. But I think the other dimension is where you can actually hand off to AI to actually do some work. And I think that's where, again, as supply chain professionals, we need to, how do we think about where you can bring AI in as an actual problem solver alongside you, not just as
And
a
what's cool is we're
assistant.
actually starting to see some use cases now with that,
Yep.
right? You know, in the maritime side, we're seeing it with reviewing charter parties, right? The
Yeah.
contracts,
Yeah.
and being able to compare so that we didn't miss a clause that we maybe had in the past.
Precisely.
We
Yep.
know that, and again, it is taking work away from a human possibly, but then you still need the human to make sure what it's saying is the
Right.
decision for that time. We see, I think, law firms using it to review documents, you know, when they have discovery. I mean, that's big. We
Yeah.
have people like PwC using it to do bank reconciliations. I mean,
Mhm.
and so it's there. The
Yeah.
use cases are coming, which is great to see those use cases. And so that also makes you think of other ways to possibly use it.
No, precisely. I think that's a really important element for us to think about is as we create and free up that space, that then goes back to that value creation, that networking, that awareness of what is important to the organization. Now you can fill that with solving problems that you could never have gotten to, right? It's
Right.
all those things on your your CI backlog of problems I could never get to because I was
Yeah.
too busy updating my master data records.
Yep.
Now AI is doing that for you. Here
I
are a
think, yep.
whole host of things that you can now tackle.
I think, and maybe this is sort of idealistic, and maybe it is going to change someday, but to me, you know, I put out that weekly newsletter. I could use AI to do it,
Right.
but there's still the process, and there is some worry that
That's right.
AI will change the way we learn or limit
Mhm.
learning because you don't need to learn anymore.
Right.
And I do worry about that with students and young people, that you still need to dive into the process of writing a paper, of doing the research. Use AI maybe to help you write the outline for the paper,
Right.
to suggest topics for that paper that you need to dive into.
Yeah.
But I want to, at least for now, and maybe it's going to change someday, it probably will, but for now, let's not lose sight of the process of learning, whether you're an employee doing the work or that student doing the work, right? Let's not miss out on that process. And again, I may be idealistic with hoping that doesn't go away, but at least
Right.
in the meantime, let's not lose sight of the process.
Absolutely. Coming from a maritime guy, that's important anchoring. So
Yes.
thank you for that,
Yes.
Sean.
Yeah.
Appreciate it. I mean, we can certainly keep talking.
Yep.
I could keep talking to you all day,
Yep.
but maybe I'll pause here and open up if there are there any questions from folks on the call.
I have a quick question if
Please, Harrison. Go ahead.
yeah. So I guess a little background for me. I'm currently not in the supply chain sphere, currently IT consulting, but hoping to make a pivot into supply chain. And obviously you've had quite a career, John, and held several roles. I'm curious to hear, especially now, sort of how you looking at sort of the previous roles you had and going to the next, how you determine some of those transferable skills that aren't necessarily unique to a particular industry, but can be applied across industries. Especially for me, coming from a background that isn't necessarily supply chain, just right now trying to figure out and trying to really identify some of the skills that I might have still have, just in a different
Yes.
sort of umbrella.
Yep. I would say two really important skills, and this sort of goes to the AI thing in the process, is you need to be able to do critical thinking and creative thinking. And actually, I should put creative first. You need to be able to do creative thinking to come up with ideas and solutions. And then you need to be able to apply critical thinking to decide which is the avenue we're going to take, which the direction we're going to take. And I think coming from IT, there's probably some creative thinking and some critical thinking within the IT world that would cross over into supply chain. Certainly, as you're in the IT world, you can be looking at where is IT now within the supply chain environment, whether that's with ERPs, enterprise resource planning, whether that's how AI is being applied to the supply chain. I mentioned a little bit about weather routing with trucks in the holiday season, safety training, job site planning. There's plenty of companies that are using IT within spaces that it wasn't used in the past. And so I think that's what you need to think about too, is how can I take what I'm doing in IT and apply it as a tool to supply chain? And again, think about how I can exhibit my creative thinking that I've done and critical thinking that I've done within IT. Hope that makes sense.
Yes, that does. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Harrison. Appreciate the question. Any other questions?
Really, I would like to, can I add on to that really quick? I promised myself I wouldn't, but when it comes to transferable skills, my godson is a Houston police officer, HPD. I don't know his rank anymore, but we were just recently at a family thing talking, and his skills were transferable because you know what the biggest thing to make it in the sergeant exam for him was? Scenario planning. They're literally going to tell you what's happening, and you have to very quickly, how would you handle it? And I bet you do that in IT, right? You do, and he was telling me the steps he took, and I'm like, oh my God, that's exactly what risk mitigation looks like in supply chain. So I did just want to share that, and then I'll go.
Yep,
Yeah,
that's true.
scenario
And that
planning.
gets into this whole gaming things out, right? And looking at possibilities and how we would react to them. And sometimes there's multiple directions if a problem does come up.
Yeah,
Yep, and
absolutely.
it was verbal in a discussion, same that we would have, right, guys?
Exactly. Great add there, Tammy. Thank you. Okay, I think we're getting a bit close to the end of time here, John. So maybe I'll mash sort of two questions together, right? So I think we've talked a bit about where supply chain has come, where it is. Maybe help us close out with your thoughts on what excites you about the future of supply chain, and maybe tied to that is as students and early professionals are starting to navigate that future, what's a piece of advice you'd leave them with as they go into that space?
Yep. So what excites me is, again, the interconnectedness of the global economy is different than when I started the industry over 30 years ago. And so that just makes it more interesting. That makes the job harder, right? But that also is more opportunity if you can manage those challenges.
Indeed.
So that's what gets me excited. It's something different every day. I still get excited about, what's going on in the industry and how that affects what we're doing here and learning. And so that, I think, is a good segue into my advice is, and again, it's sort of cliches, don't stop learning, right? You have to, again, it's back to what Jack Welch said, you better at least be at the pace of change on the outside. And if you can, be faster.
Right.
And what I would say is, because if you're coasting and you don't have your foot on the gas, something that's coasting eventually stops if you're just coasting. And so you have to continually be watching the environment, watching what's going on, and finding those things that excite you. Yeah, that's all a personal thing. Maybe it's economics, maybe it's the world events, maybe it's IT, but within supply chain, there's some way to apply that. If you're excited about decarbonization, we're facing that challenge now. So learn as much as you can. And then I'll come back to what you said. always be thinking about depth and breadth.
All right, John, tremendous thank you for sharing your expertise and experience with us. Every time I talk to you, I learn something. And so I
Same here.
wish
Yes.
when you're on camera, I can't take quite as many notes because that'd be a bit
Yep.
rude, but I'm going to be going back over the recording
Yep.
to jot some of those down. So big
Yep.
thank
And I
you
appreciate the
for
opportunity.
joining
Thank
us
you.
today. Thank you.
All
Tammy,
right.
I'll kick it back over to you. You're on mute.